Well, welcome to the Sales Scholars, where we talk to academic experts about anything and everything sales related. Well, this week on the show, we're welcoming Charlie Ragland, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Global Sales Leadership and a clinical professor of marketing at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. Now, Charlie's research interests are in the areas of international sales management, B2B marketing, and strategy. And in this show, we're going to talk about value creation and adaptive selling, and how you can help those two strategies create wins for you in the sales world. Hey, well, welcome to the Sales Scholars podcast, and we are excited to bring to the show Charlie Ragland out of Indiana University. So, Charlie, welcome to the show.
Well, it's great to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. So, one of the things I always love to start the show out with is just to hear a little bit of our guests' backgrounds, and then specifically how in the world they got into the academic space.
Well, I've never really thought about academics early on in my career. So a graduate of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, I had a very interesting professor there, a guy named Jay Klompmaker. So he was an engineer by training before he got his doctorate, and he taught B2B marketing and sales and that type of thing at UNC. So I spent a lot of time with this one professor early in my college career, and then kind of like put it on the shelf, went out and worked for quite a while. And I said, teaching might be kind of interesting. And later in my career, I had the opportunity to teach as an adjunct at University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. One thing led to another. I began teaching a little more, and I actually ended up teaching as a lecturer there for 6 years. And during that time, I found out that, I was consulting and teaching, which a lot of us professors do. And I felt, well, if I'm going to do this long term, I need to go get a doctorate. The key was I was like 50. And so, it's a pretty big pivot, if you will, to decide to go back to school for 3 to 4 years to get a doctorate to enter the profession as a research professor on a tenure track line, which is what I did. So I got my doctorate at 55 and went in as a research professor and later got recruited to IU kind of because of the combination of practitioner background and academic background.
Gotcha. And so I know that you are also, aside from research professor, the executive director for the Center for Global Sales Leadership at IU.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that all involve in terms of the type of work you do?
Well, we really focus on, in my role in running the center, is really all things sales at IU at the Kelley School of Business. So that has to do with curriculum, that has to do with corporate partner outreach, that has to do with national team selling competitions, and everything in between. So we are the umbrella organization for anything sales. If a company comes to the business school looking for help in sales or executive learning in sales, it all funnels through us.
Okay. And now how long have you been doing that?
This is my 7th year at IU.
Okay. So it sounds like you've settled in then at IU, fair to say.
Yeah, I've settled in Bloomington. It's a great place.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know in anticipation of us getting on the call, we talked about a couple of different topics. And I remember specifically in our initial conversation, you had been commenting about value creation and the importance of it. And so I just want you to share a little bit about your perspective on value creation and how today's salespeople can really focus on delivering exactly that to their prospects.
Well, I think in the essence of what is sales, it's really about creating value. And if you're not creating value, what are you doing? I mean, what's the whole point of the exercise of being in sales and representing your company as you deal with prospective clients? And I don't believe sales is about pitching or persuading or, we got to move things through the sales funnel, but it doesn't have any meaning unless you're helping a company meet their goals and objectives. So if I'm dealing with you, the buyer, the decision maker, I got to understand what's personally important to you. I have to understand what's organizationally important to you. And I have to put a bow around that through the products and services that I represent. And I believe if you visualize sales from that perspective, all of the other things about sales kind of fall into place, because I'm not going to go call on you if I don't have some idea how I can create value. And I'm not going to walk in and do a brochure presentation to you, which has no meaning if I'm not tying it into specific needs and desires for your company. So if I haven't quantified prior to ever contacting you how I can either help you do something you can't do today, how I can help you do something you do today better, faster, cheaper, or create a new opportunity for you, there's really no fit.
Yeah. I definitely can see that in sales. I'm curious on your take, though. I find that a lot of companies or even salespeople are more about the pitch than they are about the value creation. Where did that contrast come into play, do you think?
I think, and I found that through the companies I worked for, so I was always thinking about how can I help my customer be successful. Then I'd go into training and they'd be teaching me how to pitch a product. And I'm really a B2B marketing strategy person by nature. And so it just didn't make any sense to me. I mean, but it's what was really common. I was trained coming out of school in 1980. That's really what you did is the whole value creation. So that goes back to my core industrial B2B training. Originally with Owens Corning, learning how to do that for customers. And so I always took that forward. But then when I'd work with later organizations, everything was, Xerox professional selling training, and it was features and benefits and handling objections and convincing somebody what to do. But it seems strategically, if I walked in with you and I had a way to help your business be more successful, you're more likely to listen to me and you're
Yeah.
more likely to be interested in what I'm having to say. And if I have the ability to coordinate resources and bring them to bear to help you meet those identified objectives, then the sale takes care of itself.
Yeah. That's
You
an
know, come, Coming
phenomenon.
from the South, we're kind of soft sellers. We don't believe in this hard pitch stuff. And if we do our job well enough and we demonstrate well enough how we can help you, the close just happens. The customer will close. This is
Yeah.
how do we get this thing going?
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that feel like sometimes the close or getting to the close is a often a big emphasis point in sales training. Get to the close, get to the close. But your point of but if you create value and can solve a problem for the prospect, then it sounds like what you're saying is well then they're gonna close.
Well, I mean, it's like it's always well, what's the next step? How do we get this going? I mean, because basically you're dissecting what their critical performance parameters are, and then you're demonstrating how you can help them meet those goals.
Okay. Okay.
So I used to do a lot of work with IBM over the years selling engineering materials, plastics. And I would not go in when I'm meeting with engineers who are designing the next laptop, I wouldn't walk in and pitch my next plastics products for the next laptop. What I would do is essentially, ask them, based on your new design, blank sheet of paper, what would be the key performance characteristics of an ideal material for you? And what would that help you do? And so there's always trade-offs. They always want something that's super thin, that's super tough, that won't break, that won't burn, and all these different characteristics. Well, in your mind, you know what you can do and you can't do. But what they do in that conversation is they identify and prioritize the key things they're looking for within in that case, a material system for the outside of a laptop housing, if you will. And then if you turn it back and you basically say, well, here, I can help you meet 1, 2, 3, and 4 in this order. Would that be interesting? It's just a whole different type of conversation.
Yeah. And so your comment, which I really appreciate the fact that, hey, well, one is I was trained this way because, part of it, I always wonder in sales when people are doing things one way and that there's a better way, yet the tradition of, and I'll pick on the pitch again, because I think so many companies package and promote the pitch, that, I'm like, well, how in the world did you get there? And it sounds like, training gets us there. And then I'm curious if you see any other things that have kind of gotten many companies there to that spot.
I think you're right. Training gets you there. And as I reflect on that, um, in future jobs I had after probably my initial job, the sales training people didn't like me very much because I challenged them. And I said, that makes absolutely no sense. And they're like walking around with PhDs or whatever. And they go, what do you mean? And I go, I mean, why would you push a product that doesn't have a fit that's not the best use for the customer? Well, conceptually, that is sometimes how sales is viewed. And I think that's where sales gets into trouble.
Yeah.
And you really see it on the in the financial business if you look at Wells Fargo or anything like that, where it's about B2C pushing products, pushing solutions versus helping customers get what they need. And I think in the industry I worked in, you had to develop a solution. I mean, you really were customizing solutions when you sold versus pushing a product. And I think that may have been the difference.
Yeah. So if I'm an organization today and I'm listening to what you're saying, I'm like, yeah, you know what? We've historically approached it with the pitch and we press on the close and all those things. And I buy into what you're saying. Hey, I got to shift our approach to a more value driven, value oriented approach. What would be the things that you would suggest I need to start doing in my organization right out of the gate?
I think the simplest thing is understand your ideal customer, understand why they're your ideal customer, understand what problems you're solving or what you're helping them do that makes you a great fit. And this is more getting back to the marketing piece. You're segmenting your customers. You're understanding where you have the best competitive advantage and leverage based on where you've been the most successful. And then you translate that to more people like that. And it gets into the whole segmentation of customers, and that's who you target on, and that's how you identify where you focus.
Yeah. I'm curious if you've seen any, maybe like best practices or an organization who does a good job of kind of first segmenting their customer and then being able to help create that value proposition the way you've talked about.
In the years past, I would just have to draw my experience. GE Plastics, when they were still part of General Electric, was one that probably set the standard for that, because they would develop new material systems and then they would go do value-based pricing based on segmentation and value. So if they created a clear, tough plastic, and you think of polycarbonate, it might be used on the headlamps on your car, also on a football helmet, also on a medical device, also on a cell phone, also on eyeglasses. They would segment those markets separately. They would price the product differently, even though it was pretty much the same thing. And so that's pretty much the model. And that was the Jack Welch model coming out of plastics. Jeff Immelt came out of plastics. And when I was there, one of the leading performance business units at GE, that's what they did. So for years, people would then go hire people from GE Plastics and go, how do we do this?
Okay. And so then you end up seeing that carry over into other industries. And I know GE is one of those organizations who, has fed a lot of the leadership in other organizations over the years.
Well, until the last 10, probably, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Then things changed.
They had quite a run. And a lot of that was that value-based marketing approach that they did.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I would think today, in the midst of this pandemic and the fact that a lot of organizations are encountering new challenges, that the opportunity for a company who really understands their customer, but then also really understands the value that their product brings, would be best positioned to provide, be the supplier of choice or the product of choice for companies trying to solve these new problems.
I mean, you would think so. And if you go back to some of the Challenger work with the Challenger sale and that type of when I first read the book by Britt Adamson and the other authors, it essentially said to me, those salespeople that understand how they can create value, they use the term insight with their customers and do their research before they call, are more successful than those that don't. And so if you reflect on that, you go, well, yeah, that makes sense. I think the key finding of that whole book is only 17% of the people do.
Yeah.
So if you think about what are the other 83% of the people doing? They're just showing up and dialing or doing product pitches or whatever, and that's crazy. Um, but I think that's very much what happens. So in today's world, and you're looking at, more buyers being involved in decisions, getting information from more different places, and the whole having to reconcile the buying process. How do you create value? As you walk in there, you understand their business, you understand their industry, you understand how you've created value in the past, and most likely how you can help those companies be successful today. And that's where you begin your conversation.
Yeah.
And so your job is to enter as the expert consultant in your field. If you don't take that approach, I don't know what you're doing. Right?
That statistic that you quote, I mean, 17% of the people are doing it. 83% you wonder what they're doing. I mean, there's the massive gap in the marketplace that this approach can fill.
And you do wonder why that's the case. I am concerned that sales is becoming too process oriented. In other words, advance the pipeline. And there's the good aspects of AI, but you also have to be able to think, and you got to be creative, and you have to be able to understand how to approach different customers and really be able to think that through. So I sometimes wonder if we're losing a little bit of that as we focus on process.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So for an organization who might be in the midst of focusing on process or heavily emphasizing process, what kind of advice would you give them to make sure that they're balancing that against some of the things you talked about?
I think in the early qualification stages of the sales pipeline, they would have a lot of rigor around what's my ideal customer look like and why. And then they would have some type of metrics that you would score. How likely is this customer to fit our ideal scenario, and not advance opportunities through the pipeline until you've really made the case that this is an ideal customer.
Yeah.
It's not that different from new product development. Years ago when the stage gate process came out, and in a really quick example, we would look at a lot of new product development opportunities based on sales would bring them in marketing, and they'd take them to R&D, and they'd build a business case. And until we had a product champion, until we moved the business case to the front end of that process and said, who's the customer, will they buy, what's their return on investment, and do it all on the front end, we had 1,000 opportunities. Once we moved that filter in the new product development, all of a sudden, we had 100.
Okay.
And basically what it did is it made us really understand, to be very specific about why should we spend resources on this opportunity from an R&D product development situation when you know that the success rate there is like 10%. So if you try to do everything, nothing's going to happen. But if you put it on the front end, all that analysis, then you're only focusing on your most likely prospects to win. And so the question becomes, how likely am I to win in this opportunity?
Well, I would have to think that you would also cut out a bunch of waste, whatever the waste looks like, whether it's time, energy, whatever it is that people are doing to fill that pipeline on the front side, if you are doing that more effectively.
I think it's important because I always ask my students, if you don't know how you're going to create value with a customer, why would you call them?
What a great question. Because in students, I love this about students, but also you see the limitation where that you just say, hey, you got to call people. So they go, okay, I'll call people.
Yeah. And, so that makes them think, well, that means, well, gosh, I have a lot of upfront work, and that takes time. So, am I willing to invest all of that upfront research and investigation and being able to answer that question before I make my first call? All of a sudden, I feel like I'm behind. I'm not meeting my activity measures. I'm not meeting all those other measures. But at the end of the day, if my job is to make 5 appointments a week and I can do it with 20 phone calls instead of 100, that's probably better.
Yeah. Well, and I think your point is look, if you start with who the ideal customer is and you go through the homework on the front side of, if it's quantifying or measuring them up against some type of system, then your likelihood of being able to do that, not have to make the 100, make the 20, seems like it would go up.
Well, and I think so. And I also think you can confirm on your first or second call, you can validate, is this true? And it's better to validate a hit or miss in 2 calls than 10 calls.
Yeah.
And a lot of the peers I worked with in my area were chemical engineers, and because it was a technical sale, they would call on somebody 10 or 15 times before they finally figured out it wasn't a fit. So think about that time wasted and the efficiency there or lack thereof. So I believe if you can do it on the front end, and maybe the organization has to help you do that, the marketing people have to help you do that and help you really identify and understand where the best fits are, you're just going to be more effective, more efficient. You're going to have a higher close rate.
Yeah, I can see, yeah, higher close rate and fewer calls. I think your point of but more homework on the front side.
Yep.
But that's improving the efficiency. So no, I think that's valuable perspective that today's business leaders and practitioners they need to hear, because there is this pressure on activity generation and filling your pipeline, that there could also at the same time be a ton of waste in that stuff.
I think it's really interesting to look at it by industry. So when I look at companies that are product companies, they've been around for a long time. We know the brands. They think this value-based selling. I mean, that's because that's how they have to do their job. If you're P&G and G and you're coming out with a new product, you have to demonstrate to the retailer how you're going to grow their margin through your product. I mean, that's really what the sale is. It's not about the product. It's about maximizing return on shelf space, if you will, if you're in
Yeah.
that type of business. I think the software industry is coming late because I've seen all of these articles written that, value is the new selling, and it's all about, outcome-based selling or value-based selling. And this is 2020, and you're going, no, we've been doing this forever. But I believe in that industry, and I'm not from the software industry, but it seems they have been more transaction oriented on the front end. And now they're having to be much more value based. It's becoming more complex. There are more people involved. So the value selling is really rising to the top for them too. But it's a new skill.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like it in some industries, but to your point, there's also legacy programs and organizations who, hey, people have done this before, and so it's just adapting to a particular, adapting maybe a style to a particular industry.
Yeah.
I know we talked a little bit previously about that adaptive selling just in general, and if I recall, one of the areas that you have done a little bit of research work around or studied some is this idea of how sales teams can work with prospects from different geographies. And so I'm wondering, if are there some specific tactics sales leaders can use to help their team be a little bit more adaptive in their approach?
I think fundamentally adaptive selling in my mind is modifying your approach to be successful in a certain situation, right? And so, well, first you have to recognize there's a situation. So you have to have the antennas up. You have to really be able to tune in and ask questions and read and understand and interpret to see what is the situation you're actually selling in. And if you're doing it on a cultural base, am I going directly to business or do I need to build a relationship? What's more important to do first? Because if I do the wrong one first, I'm not going to get the sale.
Yeah.
If I go to Brazil and I get right down to business, they're going to throw me out. I have a great story of a friend of mine who was in business development, and he was calling in Japan. And he tells me about the day he flew halfway around the world. He was from the South, so he walked in and did a little of his Southern rapport building, and then he jumped right into business. And they said, if it was me, thank you, Mr. Ragland. It's been very nice talking to you today. We look forward to our future meetings. Meeting ended because he jumped right into business.
Huh.
And that was a 45-minute meeting after having flown from New York
Oh,
to Tokyo. So if you jump in too quick in the relationship-based cultures, you blow it. And I think in the more bottom line oriented cultures, if you spend your time building the relationship, they're moving on. They really want to get down to business. So I think being able to recognize that and modify your approach in those situations will make you more successful. So if we take that into whether I'm selling in different regions of the US or I'm selling internationally, I think it's important to know what the business norms are and know how you're going to modify your approach to deal with those.
yeah. Well,
And it gets into asking questions and just having your antennas up and listening and really trying to read the situation and then decide how you should proceed.
yeah. And I've seen both it work and work well and not work well. You mentioned the two dimensions, the relationship culture and a get down to business culture.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about working with people, are there other dimensions that you consider in the adaptability approach?
From a cultural standpoint, there could be just something as simple as time orientation. There could be something as simple as hierarchy. In our country, we kind of go first name and pretty casual, and we kind of treat everybody as equals. If I'm dealing in some organizations, that's entirely inappropriate. Titles and being formal is very important. So there's several different dimensions, whether it's power and hierarchy, whether it's individual versus the group, whether it's a time orientation. All of those factors are important depending on the group you're dealing with. I was doing a conference call one time with this global group. We were doing a global research project, and I had the North American team, I had the India team, and I had the Southeast Asia team on, and we were kind of just giving an update. So typical North Americans, the moderator would throw out a question and we would just pop off and answer the question, right? Somebody who knew the answer would just jump in. And then it was really interesting. When we went to the India group, who was doing a lot of Southeast Asia, they would ask the question. The managing director would field the question. He would hand it off to one of his people who would answer the question, who would then refer back to the managing director, who would then turn it back over to the moderator. And that communication style was so interesting. But when you think about doing business in India versus doing business in North America, how different it is, it really showed up just in that environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like the advice is, hey, first study. It almost goes back to a little bit of what we talked about with creating value. Everything starts with research and studying and trying to understand the scenarios that you're stepping into.
Well, it's like if you go call on a customer, are you going to look at all their LinkedIn profiles in advance or not?
Yes, I'm going to.
I mean, I am. I'm going to at least try something, even if we're dealing with companies now in my current role. If I'm dealing with a company and they're new, I want to find out who I'm talking to and where they went to school and how long they've been working and what various jobs they've had and what their perspective is before we have the call.
Yeah.
I mean, just to have some place to start.
Yeah. I like to read I read recommendations when they're there for people, just because I'm curious as to if I'm going to talk to this person. I can remember reading a recommendation, a couple of recommendations about somebody I was going to talk to about something, and the theme of they get down to business was pretty clear. It was so and so results oriented, great with details, very action oriented. You're reading these recommendations. I'm thinking, okay, I better go into this meeting with a get down to business approach.
It's interesting, and I see that as I've worked in most parts of the country and sold in most parts of the country, and the style really does vary as you move around. I imagine in Texas it varies between cities a little bit without knowing, but I bet if
Yeah,
you're a Texan, you know that San Antonio and Lubbock, Houston, and Dallas are going to be a little different,
for sure.
right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, and we try to coach our students to be aware. Most of our students are from the Midwest, so they're kind of neutral, so they can adapt pretty easily. So it's not even something they're really sensitive to. I mean, when they come to our school.
That's some powerful lessons I think that companies and individuals from sales teams need to hear. So we are at the end of our show. So Charlie, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you joining us and sharing your experience and your insight.
Well, thank you, Craig. It's been fun.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed the conversation.